All right, friends, welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin here with my co-host, Mike Sauter. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. Happy, you and I both hate these movable feasts. Happy Epiphany, my brother.
Happy Epiphany. Yeah. In fact, I'm still recovering from our 12th night party last night.
Congratulations. Yeah, I
We
talked
had
to
a
our friend.
house full of people.
Tell me more about it.
Actually, one of our former guests was here. Jonathan Geltner was here with his wife and children.
Yeah.
And we had 20 some, maybe 25 people here at the house. A lot of little kids, which was great.
Michael Martin and his family single-handedly restoring the festival year.
We wassailed the apple trees. We sang. Actually, I recently wrote about this in my blog that I wrote an arrangement of Scarborough Fair, which I made everybody sing with me yesterday, and it was good. And actually, we also did a song that actually our theme song on the the podcast version, not the YouTube version, which is a song I wrote for William Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night to his lyrics. Right, the wind and the rain. So we sang that because it was Twelfth Night. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Twelfth Night. We're here to talk about medicine and science. And we have a very special guest today, Dr. Ken Thorp, who only lives about 25 miles away from me. And he's been to my farm at least one time a few years ago. And we're here to talk to Ken. And I thought I would contextualize what we're doing with a little bit of my own work. So my own academic work is in early modern religious thought, kind of like the fringe religious thought. So a lot of the figures I've written about from that period were not only religious thinkers, they were also physicians or scientists, or we call natural philosophers at the time. And one of them I've written about quite a bit is Thomas Vaughan, who was the twin brother of the metaphysical poet Henry Vaughan. And I was just looking up things yesterday, anticipating where we're going to, because one of the things Dr. Thorp talks about and has kind of reintroduced into the medical conversation is the idea of ether, or the ethers as they were called. And so I was looking up in John Donne, who used a lot of alchemical and scientific metaphors in his poetry. And I was looking for rarefied air or ether, which is not, those are not the words he uses. He uses the word quintessence.
Yep, right.
Which is what many of them did. And that's what Henry Vaughan or Thomas Vaughan uses too. And Thomas Vaughan, interestingly, was not only an alchemist, but he was also an Anglican priest. And here's what he says in his book, Magia Adamica. This blessed cement and balsam is the spirit of the living God, which some ignorant scribblers have called a quintessence. For this very spirit is in the chaos, and to speak plainly, the fire is his throne. For in the fire he is seated, and we have sufficiently told you, as we have sufficiently told you elsewhere. So this is still part of the medical understanding of the world in the early modern period. But actually, while Thomas Vaughan was writing, he was writing against Descartes in the kind of materialist science that was coming up.
That's a good fight. That's a good fight.
It is a good fight. That's right. Take him down. And so he and a lot of the other figures I've written about, I always thought of them as traditionalists in a way, because they were scientists of the age, but they were rejecting the materialist paradigm that was coming in. And I've always said in my writing on the podcast that I've always wondered what would have happened to science and medicine had not the focus on the purely material happened through the course of the 17th century and afterwards. And as John Milbank has called my work, an alternative modernity. And we know there's an alternative modernity out there in science as well. In homeopathy, for instance, it's an alternative modernity. It's another stream that's been there, but kind of underground. And what's been really exciting to me is a mutual friend of ours, Therese Schroeder-Schieker, who we've also had as a guest on our show, started sending me these articles by Dr. Thorp and his brother, who's also a physician. And they were reintroducing this idea of ether into the medical conversation. And then I thought, Mike, we got to talk to this guy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not only is he almost a neighbor, but he's doing something that's supremely important. So welcome to the show, Dr. Ken Thorp.
Thank you very much, Michael.
And so if you could, give us a little bit of your background before we get into your groundbreaking discoveries here.
Well, by training, I'm an interventional radiologist, and I came out into practice, roughly 40 years ago, the early 80s. I was involved in catheter work and non-invasive surgical procedures, and continued to do that. Currently, I'm still in practice, although all I do is diagnostic radiology.
And so
That's
what
it.
has been the path
humble
that
guy.
has led you from that traditional training or conventional training, you could say, to these insights you've come into in as far as energetics and et cetera come?
Well, surprisingly enough, it came because I was an interventional radiologist, and I spent half my professional life inside other people's arteries, and I started making observations that didn't jibe with what I had been taught in medical school, and it was a profoundly disturbing or disorienting experience for me to have to put together on my own phenomena that I had seen and experienced, and finding out that I had been taught wrong.
So what kinds of things were you seeing?
Well, so let's just contextualize this back to William Harvey. Because, we're sitting here with what some regard as the greatest medical discovery in history, 1628, and he publishes his book on the motions of the heart, and for the first time in history, describes the circulation of the blood. But what most people don't realize is that at that point in time, he introduced a grave error in the descriptions of the contraction and dilation of the heart. And he introduced the metaphor of the heart as a pump, and specifically describing it as that. And the problem with that is that in this model, it projected or propelled blood forward through the heart or through the arteries. But the problem is that once you get to the level of the capillaries, all the pressure head is dissipated, and there's no way for the blood to get back to the right side of the heart. And it was a glaring error, and it was commented on over the years by many, many people. And so there was no way of understanding how blood flowed through the veins, and they had all these makeshift theories like, oh, it's due to the negative inspiration of the breathing in the chest. When they breathe in, they pull it back, or it's due to the milking action of muscles. But the fact is, I would be sitting there and I'd be seeing people sitting quietly, breathing quietly, laying on a table, and it would be rushing up to the right side of the heart. And and in younger people, it was as fast as in the arteries. And I'd be going, what is going on here? And it was only after a period of years that I realized there had to be a suction force, a negative suction force in the heart that was pulling the blood back. And so I started doing research on that. And sure enough, in the early 80s, a number of researchers had found a negative pressure within the right ventricle in early diastole. Diastole is the dilation portion of the cardiac cycle. You got systole, which is contraction, and diastole, which is opening up. And so you have a negative pressure there. And it was, oh my God, this just answers everything. This is like an epiphany. And at that point, I became addicted to medical history and to reading the medical literature, because it was a new frontier where you can just, you go through and it's like nobody did the synthesis. Nobody went through this. So we're talking 350 years after a grave error, and nobody put it together.
Right.
Well, that's in as an analogy in Catholic theology, that's what they call the Manualist Tradition, where you read the book and it tells you what you're supposed to do in the book, but it might not even jibe with the experience you have. And in fact, as I'm sure you know, in fact, another thing I was looking at yesterday in preparation was in Rudolf Steiner's book, The Origins of Natural Science. He says right here, people began to think that the heart is really a pump that mechanically pumps the blood through the body because they no longer knew that our inner fluids have their own life and therefore move on their own. They never dreamed that the heart is only a sense organ that checks on the circulation of the fluids in its own way. So it's been out there, right? People have been saying it, but it's not in the textbooks. but it responds directly to a phenomenological observation of what's right in front of you, right?
Right.
And what's even more perplexing about it is that for nearly 1,500 years before Harvey, all physicians regarded the heart. This is Galen in the 2nd century described the motions of the heart correctly, and he said dilation was the primary movement of the heart, and that it exercised a suction, or he used the word attraction force, so that blood was literally being pulled back. And it was an article of faith or an article of knowledge by all physicians up to the time where Harvey, in his quintessential era-defining experiment, overturned it. And then we go into this 350 years of dogma and darkness.
Yeah,
There's a couple of things. One is, and I'll ask you a question as I end, but I was running a little bit behind, but on my way this morning, I knew I was going to look for a section of the classic work Kristen Lavensdatter, because I remember reading that, the story takes place before Harvey, and they're describing a body where the heart's still beating, but they can see it. And they're describing everything, again, opposed to Harvey. They see the suctional force, and it's there in literature. The second one would be, and it's a beautiful passage because it's so, again, it's just good writing. And somebody's observing life as opposed to what Michael's saying, the Manualist tradition, looking at life through the lens of preconceived notions. But the social history component, before we came on, I mentioned to Dr. That my hero, that everybody knows, is Ivan Illich. He mentioned that talk about deleterious effects.
Medical nemesis.
Yeah, right. It's a great book. And that, based on Harvey's model of the pump, Paris was setting up a sewer system. And then so what it did, fine, they're going to pump all the shit, we'll use that word, out. But what he can also point out is that we have, everybody's interested in like local farming and so forth. He wanted to make the case that, prior to Harvey's septic system, which took all this great, now we look at it as compost and things like that, but it got it outside the city walls. But prior to that, Paris was more than self-sufficient with vegetables and everything. They were exporting vegetables to the surrounding countryside, and the grains were coming in. And that, it just changed the notion of what cities could do. It changed the notion that we looked at our own processes. And the third one, and I wonder, studying medical history, is the notion again of this myth of origins, right? Everybody, the Big Bang, and the heart as a pump. All of a sudden in history, everybody was looking for this first thing that happened, and I just consider that an adolescent way of looking. And science went through its adolescent phase where we just need the beginning domino. So the domino theory in history has also been so deleterious, right? If Southeast Asia goes communist, the whole world would go communist. So let's kill all of Vietnam. But it's a theme we haven't brought up in this podcast too much. But all these things are when a certain form of the scientific mind, which I call an adolescent version of it, we're just looking for that first domino to fall. We're always looking. And I think Big Bang cosmology, for another one, is falling apart in our time analogously. But,
exactly.
you know,
100%.
oh, great. I'm so glad. Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Well,
and
you
it
know,
comes from
that
an adolescent search for these beginnings. We can't handle the mystery of like, that space goes seemingly on forever and small things get smaller and smaller. And, we're going to see where we end up today. William Blake said this is all resolved in some beautiful notion of the whole cosmos as a human body. I don't know if we're going to end there, but it seems to be more accurate than this whole kind of silly adolescent, that there's a beginning of the universe whose diameter was 0, but had infinite mass and it blew up into space that wasn't there before. We're asked to believe such cockamamie stuff because of this need to find an origin, the first domino. And then if we find that origin, be damn sure we have power and control, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Mhm.
That's I think about that a lot, and there's two aspects. I mean, obviously, in Buddhism, there's no focus on origins. It's just you don't need to invoke creation. You don't need to invoke this. It's just give an accurate explanation of how things are, and you're good enough. The second point is I read in the past handful of months Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, because we're in an epochal time right now, and there are many people that claim that the pandemic response constituted a totalitarian action. And so I went back and read, and what's interesting about it is if you look at her descriptions of what constitutes a totalitarian system, modern science meets all the criteria.
Mhm.
It's a dominating ideological system that demands complete obedience, and there's very little room for thinking outside the box in modern science,
as we have seen. Mhm. So it's interesting, same thing. I'm looking at we're comparing the modern scientific paradigm and its roots in the late early modern period, and also what we can call the Manualist tradition. It's interesting, kind of the Big Bang moment for a lot of traditionalist Catholics is the Council of Trent, and they think everything starts there, but they have no idea of how crazy and loose everything was in the Catholic Church prior to that, and that these councils are usually only called because the bishops are losing control, but which is this is this kind of organic and phenomenological approach to things versus the authoritarian, right? Which is what we've seen in both of those structures over the last 500 years, for sure, right?
Oh, yeah.
The medical structure and the religious structure.
Right.
And that's just very briefly, Michael, that ties in when you began, you talked about how kind of science could have gone a different way. And I'm going to say too, like education could have gone a different way, but we always bring in kind of the church or the Catholic Church. But, we're looking at what's going on, even the church right now with all these liturgy wars, but it's been so desiccated from medicine and education for so long.
Mhm.
But, I almost want to blame, there was a cultural institution out there that could have had a voice on this stuff at a seminal time. There was an institution that could have claimed to have an understanding of who the human person was, and we can't quite get all these things to say like, which thing did what. But when we're talking about science that had a possibility of not taking this wrong turn, it's because the church didn't put out its best there. Our friend Guido, who's going to come up here, just said the church hasn't produced a towering intellectual in 200 years or more. That could have been at the right time to see the Harvey thing come and say, oh my gosh, this is a crazy way of thinking. This is not the best,
Well, Guido, and as Guido says in his book that's coming out pretty soon, the big part of the problem is how church leadership was co-opted by the empire, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So looking forward to that book. Guido, get it out, man. So speaking of Guido Preparator, Guido is the son of the late Giuliano Preparator, who was a physicist and pretty much a maverick. And his work overlaps Ken's a little bit because
A lot, I think. Yeah.
I have a lot. And in fact, I just got a phone call from Therese a couple days ago, and she says, "Is Giuliano Preparator related to Guido?" I said, "Yeah, it's his dad." Oh, Ken will love this guy. So what one of the things Giuliano Preparator was doing is he was working on the memory of water, and this was in the 60s or 70s, probably the 70s, huh, Mike?
I think so. Yep.
By the 70s. So I think, and this is definitely something that touches on Ken's work. So I wonder if you could talk about water a little bit then, Ken.
Well, yes, and let's right now just go back to the advances that have been made in the last 2 decades. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Gerald Pollock, The Fourth Phase of Water.
Mm-hmm.
Remarkable book, because water isn't what we thought it is. And it's there's that book by the philosopher Hae-Sok Chang, Is Water H2O? And he makes the argument that no, it's more than that, and it's really an element unto itself. And that's basically what Pollock shows, and what he found in his research was that water, we've been conditioned to think of it as ice, liquid, and steam or vapor, but it actually has a fourth phase, a structural phase. And that water in natural systems and in the human body, by the way, water is the conveyor of energy in the human body. And what happens is that in the liquid state, water has 2 distinct phases. What Pollock calls exclusion zone, or EZ water, and bulk water. And these are like 2 phases of water with very distinct properties. This exclusion zone water undergoes structuration and forms like nanocrystals, hexagonal or octagonal crystalloid structures that organize around, mainly around hydrophilic surfaces, like the edges of cells, the edges of molecules that have a charge to them. And this exclusion zone layer of water then kicks out solutes. It kicks out particles. And so it has a higher density. It has an alkaline, it's alkaline rather than acidic. And the adjacent bulk water is acidic and thinner. And then what Pollock notes is that once these 2 phases of water form, there's a voltage potential between them, a charge potential, and there's a net flow of energy from the EZ water. So it's actually a resonant structure. It resonates, and it has a relationship, believe it or not, with the ether, and it's literally pulling in energy, which is then used in systems. And for instance, this is very interesting because Pollock is into phenomenology, and his book, The Fourth Phase of Water, it's an incredible work. It's incredible. And he just goes through the natural world and says, why didn't we notice this before? And one of the fascinating examples to me is, okay, you've been on a boat before, and you're moving along, and you look behind the boat, and it's got a wake, and you'll often see the disturbance that the boat made, and it'll sometimes be there for 20 minutes, right? You ever notice that?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening there? What Pollock says is that the EZ water, the structured water, tends to accumulate at the top the water collection, because, by the way, it's sensitive to light. And so it sits up there, and when you go through in a boat, you're you're violating that stability, and it takes a period of time to reform. Now, who has ever thought of something like that?
Right,
And yet
right.
it makes perfect sense. And my partner in Grand Rapids and I, we've done a lot of research on water, and you can introduce this clear EZ water by magnetizing the water, by light. And so water is an energetic medium. It carries energy, and it's in the body, for instance. Water surrounds all bioactive molecules like proteins, and that's how proteins execute their function, and it's how they take on their three-dimensional structure.
Yeah, and no, it's probably so speaking of the alternative modernity, another figure I would have to mention here is Victor Schauberger, right? Who the water wizard, he was of Bavaria. Do you know about him, Mike?
Yeah, of course. Even that
he was
documentary people can find on YouTube is so wild, and how he was abducted.
Yeah, and he was just a forester, and he just came up to this stuff by observing water.
He's the Nikola Tesla of water, right? He just saw what water was,
And he also invented a spaceship.
Right? Yeah, using suctional force, and vacuums, when water spirals down, he just saw that power.
I'm sure DARPA has him.
and Dr. Kent, this, we mentioned Guido, his dad, to kind of give a little context to where I see your work overlapping. His dad, he would say, was essentially canceled, because he challenged Richard Feynman's. There's a poem you could look up. If you Google like James Gleick, the science writer who wrote on chaos.
Right.
There's this famous poem about the young fiery guy who wants to take on, the god Richard Feynman, and Giuliano Preparator was a fiery guy. And so there's a famous poem that's read at a lot of physics conferences about when Giuliano Preparator stood up to challenge Feynman. The end result, though, is that he was essentially canceled, right? He maintained his chair at Princeton, but his papers. But Guido, his son, kind of has that same fiery spirit. I don't think the temper, but, and I'm forgetting the third part of it, but when we're talking about like, why hasn't there been research into the memory of water? And the main scientist years ago was Benveniste, I believe. Just like for cold fusion, it was Fleischmann and Pons. But it's to say that right now, cold fusion, if anybody's been paying attention the last month, it's back into the news cycle.
Yep.
And it's simply because, we might, with this crazy war with Russia and Ukraine, he just wanted to say, like the empire, if they ever let medical stuff be healed through water and not all of these interventions that cost so much and make so much money and energy, they're not going to give up their profit potentials of energy through cold fusion. Bill Gates has millions and millions and millions of dollars invested in cold fusion now. But only a couple months ago, if you mentioned the name Giuliano Preparator in cold fusion, they would have called you, you're a lunatic. You're a lunatic. They're still calling people who are researching the memory of water or water memory, lunatics.
Fringe scientists.
Yeah, but we just got to realize, let's not make it pure a one-to-one correspondence, but certainly when we're thinking of this, we have to think of, the loss of profit. Why certain scientists are cast out of the field is because if we began to see the potential of water for healing, and if we began to take the insights of all these people we've mentioned, including Schauberger, think of the gazillions of dollars that are in jeopardy from that. Can you speak to that a little bit, Ken?
Well, let me just, but let's just look at this path not taken theme, because about 4 years ago, before the pandemic, a remarkable book came out from Russia by two Russian scientists. It's called The Emerging Science of Water. The first author, I think his name is Valentin Voykov, and the other guy's name is Karatkov. And this is this had to be it was maybe 2018, and they were huge on Pollock, and we're saying, oh, this is revolutionary work, but then they go over and they start saying, but Russian scientists had been talking about the same thing for decades, and they were talking about how, for instance, in water, or in Russia, they use magnetized water for crops. They've always believed in it. They drink it. So they talk about this important idea of water as an energetic medium. And it was, when I read that, it was the first realization I had that homeopathy, there was something behind it. And they actually solved the riddle of homeopathy, because in the act of succussing your homeopathic remedies, you're using water, and you're building up an energy, a resonance structure within the water. And
the resonance structure is what they call the memory of water.
the memory, right? And for instance, I don't know if you know about this, but the homeopaths can be as dogmatic as any scientist. And
sure.
The homeopathic tradition split in the mid to late, I think mid 19th century, and went off into two different paths. The one path was the high dilutionalists, and the second path was the low dilutionalists. And Hahnemann, the more he did, the more he realized that you really didn't need the medicine that you were putting into it, and that the more you diluted it and the more you succussed, the more energy that it have. And they started going off and saying, just use just use the high dilution. And they were doing dilutional therapies of 1,000 or more fold dilution. And remember, after about the seventh or eighth dilution, there's no physical substance left in the preparation.
Let's stay with this for a little bit, because I think the first time Guido mentioned this, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, that's this alchemical principle, right? That the more you reduce the physicality of a thing, the more powerful the spirit becomes, right?
Wow.
So kind of the same analogy. That's what was doing. And I remember teaching as a Waldorf teacher how weird water is. It's just, people don't think about it because it's so common, but it's the weirdest thing. I mean, how many substances out there do you know that expand when they get colder?
Right.
Just water. So it's bizarre. It's the weirdest thing, and it's it's the source of life, and it's the most misunderstood, or not even taken for granted. Talk about the philosopher's stone, right?
Yeah.
It's the thing we ignore, and it's all over the place.
Yeah. Illich has a book.
And maybe we've been led to not unlock its secrets on purpose. Of course, I'm a conspiracy theorist.
In one sense, I think that's true. And this, I guess, two things. One is, this Ivan Illich. I think it's his least read book. You mentioned Medical Nemesis, Ken, but he also has a book called H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. Now, I hadn't thought of so much that he's talking symbolically. It was about a lake. He went to a public meeting because an inner city lake was going to be dug in the city of Dallas, and people wanted to. There were the pros and cons, and for some reason he was invited to speak, and the water was going to be pumped in, and he just said, like, hey, do whatever you want to do, like, you do you, bros. But he said, like, this stuff that comes from a fountain, or from a garden hose, how does this stuff H2O connect with the waters of in Greek mythology? And he wondered if H2O could be valid baptismal matter. Isn't that fascinating? When you're saying H2O, this kind of way we've seen it, if we've reduced what Michael so excellently said, I didn't know Steiner would just say, like, water is weird, but that's the greatest lesson that Waldorf education could teach. But once we've reduced water to H2O and we see water that way, then can it affect what the Christians and the Catholics believe about baptism? But it's a little track that captures on this whole history that is beautiful. And when you mentioned, I think when we talked, we've mentioned Preparator again. I hadn't thought of the second part of the title of that book, the Waters of Forgetfulness, which is that same theme of memory and water.
What else is interesting, because if you go back and look at the 19th century development of theories of electromagnetism, and the work of Faraday and physicists like him, like Heaviside and all those. So we have three basic forms of energy, all of which come out of ether, and all of which have an intimate relationship with ether. And so we have magnetism, which is the only energy form that possesses three dimensionality. So it literally gives us the space that we reside in. Then we have what Faraday coined the dielectric field, and the dielectric field is it's in substance, and it's the primary energy form that causes things to come together. And when it's exposed to an electrical field, it breaks apart, separates into positive and negative. And then the third form is radiant energy, light and electricity. And what's interesting about water is that it has an intimate relationship. It's the only substance like this. It has an intimate relationship with all three energy forms. Water has the highest, or one of the highest, dielectric constants of any substance. There are other substances higher, but it's way high. It holds magnetism very powerfully, and it conducts DC currents. So it's unique. I mean, everything else is divided into insulators or conductors or this, but water's the real deal. It has a real relationship with all the energy forms.
We should have T-shirts made that say "Water is the real deal."
That's right. Water is the real deal. So,
dielectricity or dielectric, help me again with that. I read some of your articles, and I just wondered if it was like, I admit to struggling with that because it's new to me. Like it was like ambient energy, but electricity I saw is that stuff that goes through wires or something. But if you can give that to me one more time, and I might be echoing a question our listeners have.
Just the dielectric?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's give it in real experimental terms, because back in the 1890s, physicists were struggling with this. The idea that was introduced by these flowing currents and what effects they had. And Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish physicist who I think won a Nobel Prize somewhere around the turn of the century, he was the first one to describe this. And as soon as I tell you this, you'll understand, because these experiments were done as early as the early decades of the 19th century, where you got a water bath and you run a DC current through it, and so you've got a cathode and an anode, and the cathode is the point at which the current enters, and then at the other end, supposedly, and this is a big suppose, okay, but supposedly the anode at the other end is where the current exits. And what happens between these two electrodes is that you get around the cathode this expansionary force that if you're in a test tube, the water actually expands in volume, whereas on the other side, it's contractional, and you get a buildup of acids and particles and crap like that, and so that there's two different behaviors, and so he introduced this notion of these electrolytes as following the to one pole or another, and that's how all these terms came about. So for instance, if you put salt into a water solution and run a DC current through it, you're going to get one set of like the sodium is going to want to gravitate towards the negative, and the chloride's going to go the other way, and that's how it sort of happens. They separate out. So Faraday had seen these kind of behaviors, and I think he had a colleague named Waywell and he was asking him, well, what are we going to call this? And they came up with this term dielectric just because it created oppositional species. And believe it or not, we see this in the cell. The cell is like a little, it's a little dielectric battery. So yeah, that's like a basic form. And if you read the work of Wheeler, he claims that the dielectric field, and I think he's right. The dielectric field is the primary energy form, this flowing current that causes substances to attract and congeal. You know, the Feynman's like.
Yeah.
And so it causes formation, and then in certain substances like ferromagnetic material, when the dielectric field acts, it causes the nuclei to precess and align and throw off the magnetic field externally, creating a magnet. So you got magnetism as a secondary field, and then radiant energy, like from the sun and stars, is a third form.
Fascinating.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yep.
So I want to connect this next to another point that that I find fascinating in your work, and it's also the reason I'm interested in it, because my interest in early modern poetry is it's rife with this stuff, with references, for instance, in Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, one of the most popular poems in freshman English courses in college, is this reference to the vegetable soul. And he says, I probably do it from memory, but my vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. And then John Donne talks about his different souls, right? And what they're talking, this is the very medieval understanding, and it's Aristotelian, right? That we participate in the creation around us, and vice versa, in a kind of reciprocal relationship, and how we have a vegetative soul that makes us grow. We have an animal soul, which gives us movement and desire. And we have the rational soul, which much later Rudolf Steiner changed into physical body, etheric body, astral body, and ego, right? And so forth. But in that medieval and early modern literature, and even in classical literature, there's this other thing that's not those four. It's not earth, air, fire, and water. There's this that we talked about earlier, the quintessence, or this other thing, which in some alchemical and other kinds of medical tracts they call ether. And it's very much connected to, Mike, we've talked about it before, we could call it the anima mundi, or the soul of the world, right? Or Sophia, right? So I wonder if you could talk about how ether comes into your work, and why that's important for us, for today.
Well, okay, you used the term soul, and by the way, I'm a huge, I just love Aristotle, and I that's in complete agreement with everything that Aristotle says. And by the way, in embryogenesis and in the human body, you can see all three of these souls at play. They are very real phenomena. And, Aristotle's synthetic descriptions of life are basically based on the premise that everything reverts to singularity. So you have to have something out of which things come. And that was his notion of ether, because you have Empedocles describing the four roots: earth, water, air, fire, and these two primal forces that he called love, which is attraction, and strife, which is dispersion. And back in those days, 5th century BC, they took these terms, love and strife, to actually represent forces. And Aristotle starts thinking on this, and when he's doing his material causes, efficient causes, formal causes, final causes, he's trying to make everything reduce to singularity. And ether was the necessary singularity out of which all the other major energy forms arose. And he coined the term ether, which literally means always running.
Mm,
And
I've heard that.
So that ether became an accepted explanatory vehicle, the same way soul, or more importantly, spirit.
Yeah.
Spirit is like the singularity of all these other forces. And so you have ether, and there were 5 medical sects in Rome, and at least 2 of them used the ether concept, and it got changed to quintessent, and then it kind of comes and goes. It was used by the Arabs, but the real first modern proponent of this ether concept in medicine was, of course, Paracelsus and his quintessence. So you needed this 5th essence. And whenever you hear people talking about the ether, it automatically tells you where their conceptual framework is coming from, because we're talking about a unitary functional field. And virtually all these people that embraced it, they saw life and saw, use the term creation, whatever that is, the natural world as a hierarchy, a ladder, a great chain of being. And the whole concept was vertical. Everything was vertical, up and down, and the top, the most general force, was the most important causally, and that became ether. That you know. So that's the Aristotelian great chain of being, right?
Right,
Mhm.
absolutely. It's first cause, primal cause, right?
Right.
So how did you come back to this in your work? I mean, you wrote these articles with your brother and seen you in interviews talking about it, and I think it's super important. And I think it's super important for the future of medicine in particular. How did you come to this, and what are the applications of it?
Well, okay, so I'm fortunate. I'm very fortunate to be in the situation that I'm in. I've studied. I've been intellectually curious, but I ran across about 10 or 12 years ago a phenomenally brilliant character in living in Grand Rapids. We crossed paths. He's an engineer with at least 4 advanced degrees. His name is Paul Walker. And Paul is the classic experimenter, alchemical experimenter. He does all his work in his own laboratory at home. And we began talking and communicating, and realized that we had this shared interest in energy and this. So Paul and I have carried on a maybe an 8-10 year conversation about energy, and he's been working on a believe it or not, a crystal battery, a resonating crystal device, which is very close to being complete. Out of water, believe it or not, using water to create a resonance field. And he and I began working on preparations that heavily magnetized water, which we tested on people, and just looking at, the medical uses of energy, or of energy in water and stuff like that. So as our relationship progressed, he kept on talking about, he calls it the Aether. And at one point, I had heard it before, and I stopped him and I said, you keep using this, but tell me what you think this is. And he goes, it's a universal substance. He goes, nobody in science knows about it. They poo-poo it, but he goes, you got all this stuff going on with dark matter and dark energy. And he goes, they don't know what it is because they threw out ether 100 years ago. And the truth is, you have to have ether to explain these things. And I got interested in that. And I started doing a research on ether, and I came up, now you'll be interested in this. I found a 45-page brilliant piece entitled Aristotle's Ether and Contemporary Science, and it's by a Catholic philosopher, theologian of all people, and it was published in the Thomist, the Thomist.
Oh, yeah.
In something like 2004. The guy's name is Christopher A. Decaen, Decaen. It is remarkable. I mean, I've read this 4 or 5 times because he basically goes through the entire history of ether, and it starts with Aristotle, and then he shows how wrong science went when they threw out ether based on the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Right.
And all
Have you
of
been in
that.
touch with this person?
Pardon me?
Have you been in touch with Christopher?
I sent, after I read him, I sent him an email and just congratulated him on his
very
work,
nice.
but I've never communicated with him.
Okay.
His work is singular. It's so toweringly good. And he's of course an apologist for Thomas Aquinas. And he
In the
points out
Thomist, he is.
that-
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, if he's in the Thomist, that's what they do over there, right?
Well, I mean, he shows
Mhm.
St. Thomas's contribution to the field, and it's not insignificant,
Mhm.
if for no other reason that he kept that concept alive,
Yeah.
right?
In fact, like Steiner in that same lecture was mentions the same thing. Actually,
Well, I mean, it's a big deal, okay? Because I mean, here you want what does a new science look like? Well, you can't have a new science without energy and without the concept of ether, and all of a sudden you're not in dogmatic molecular material science. You are back to what the theologians were writing about. You're talking about something very significant. Everybody gets into the mix on this one,
I
right?
just
Yeah.
Googled the guy.
And that's-
He taught at
and that's-
Christendom College and things. Yeah.
when
Yes, I'm sorry, what? What
I
did you
just
say?
Googled his name, and he's taught at Christendom College, where there's about like 200 students. Now he's at St. Thomas Aquinas College, and yeah, interesting.
But-
I never heard his name.
I had an
So-
instant attraction to this guy because I like his style of writing, and
Yeah, that's quite often the.
anyway,
What I was going to say is, you mentioned how this touches on theology, and this is where, what I've been drawing on, when I call Sophia, or the anima mundi, the soul of the world, right?
right,
And
right.
which is, with Louis Dupre, you know him, right?
Yeah.
Now he writes, that's like this one concept that the theologians keep trying to kick out, but it keeps coming back, and I think the scientists too keep trying to kick it out, and it keeps coming back. And is this, and I don't know his work as well as I should, but is this what Tesla was drawing on?
Oh, of course.
This universal
Of course.
source of energy, right? Yeah.
Of course. And there were a bunch of, not a bunch, but by the end of the 19th century, you had a coterie of experimental physicists that were heavy into the ether, Maxwell, and Heaviside, and Charles Steinmetz. I mean, this was very real. And then you do this stupid, flawed Michelson-Morley experiment that couldn't find it. And why would it? It was based on a stupid supposition that it was an elastic-like material.
Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Right. And then, so they published that, and then that formed the basis of Einstein's relativity, the fact that ether had been thrown out, and he pronounces it dead. And then 10 years later, he comes back and says, well, maybe we do need it. And, of course, he didn't come out strong enough. He's going, well, we could think about it in this way, but it was like too late. The horse was out of the barn, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
In your writings, can you, and I wonder only, I'm looking for visuals for myself and for like other people, some of this, it's not so heady, but like, you say the heart, does the heart pump the blood or does the blood pump the heart, and things like that. But the other one would be you point an image of a light bulb, right? And the filaments there. We're trained to think, we're trained to think that there's some energy that comes up and creates the light. And what you're saying is that it's drawing in the ambient, it's drawing from, it's creating something that's drawing in the ambient. Is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, there's
we just need to reverse the way
Paul and I have talked about this. Technically speaking, properly speaking, current doesn't flow through a light bulb filament.
Right.
That's entirely wrong. And what really happens, and by the way, it's the same thing. Let's go to a slightly different example. I bring this up all the time. Is it true that light travels from the sun to the earth? Does light travel from the sun to the earth? Does light or does electricity travel through a filament? And of course, everybody goes, well, of course it does. Oh, well, if that's the case, then why is it that the solar system doesn't entirely light up like a big gymnasium? And why isn't the whole thing lit up? And the fact is, light doesn't travel. Light is an inductive phenomenon, and what travels are the electromagnetic frequencies. They travel through the dark space, but they don't have anything to contact and interact with in the darkest recesses of space. And if you look, the only bodies that display these light properties are like the Earth, and the EMF comes and hits the atmosphere of the Earth and directly generates light, just like the light bulb when it gets, this happens, it interacts with the ether, and it's as an induction phenomenon. You get light thrown out locally from a point source.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right. No, I just think, again, it's like what I called it, the myth of origins. We're always looking at things going one way. Where,
right.
When I'm counseling students, my background's there. It's similar to me to say, when you're happy, you smile, but when you smile, it makes you happy, right? There's always kind of a both and we can see these things everywhere. But there's something about, this lobotomy we've all had that always wants to see things, just going one way. And it's just a shortcoming. We're always looking for that one-way thing, and so we're missing half the world in almost everything we look at.
Exactly.
Well, it's very interesting that if you read Plotinus's work, he's kind of regarded as the philosopher of the unconscious, and he was, had strong influence on the early Christian fathers.
Certainly, St. Augustine was just a baby,
and Oregon, and so he claims, in his, he has a 3-tier hierarchy of causation. You start at the one, you go to the IP, the intellectual principle, then you go to the all soul. But in his phenomenology of the human body, he actually tells us how reason thinks, and he's not a big fan of reason and logic. And the reason for that is this intellective or reasoning soul attaches itself to sensory phenomena, and sensory phenomena can't be used to make broad generalizations about the nature of being and existence. And in fact, this directionality of time that we get through our senses. We got day, night, we've got years, we've got, it's a one-way projective force, but that's only what our senses tell us. And we reason on our sense material and come up with these strange ideas, when in fact, earlier civilizations, again, thought entirely vertically and up and down, because that's the true causal nexus.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, and I think, thinking about like young people who might be listening too, Michael mentioned Nikola Tesla. And so you have two people like Stephen Hawking and Nikola Tesla. But and so we have the paragon of science as like Stephen Hawking, but I want to say, and I don't know 1/50th as much as you do, Ken, but to me, like Stephen Hawking, for example, not to disrespect him, he was a mathematician, right? So you come up with one side of the equation, he's missing something over here, so he posits something like dark matter or black holes, where what Nikola Tesla was doing is bringing stuff, and actually with his work with like plasma and so forth, he was the true scientist. It was reproducible at a smaller scale, right? He could do things in a laboratory. So these people that are on the outside, Tesla, Victor Schauberger in a different way, but they're the true scientists. They're not just like substituting math for the notion of science, that these are the people we need to follow.
Well, they're not consulting the manual.
What's that?
They're not consulting the manual.
Right.
Actually doing science.
Yeah, doing science. Yep,
Yeah.
that's a much better way of saying it.
Which is the thing, and I'm so glad to talk to Ken today, because now I have more justifications for cloud busting and stirring up preparations in a bucket. So
Yeah, preparations are essentially
got
like
the information right here, my man.
Water, right? Preparations are like the.
Well, that's it. I mean, that's the biodynamic preparations, which you stir in a bucket in vortexes and going both ways for an hour, enlivening water, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And it works. That's the other thing is when I started doing this stuff, I'm no scientist, but my whole approach to it when I built the Cloudbuster, I was like, well, I'm just going to see if it works, right? If it works, I'll do it. If it doesn't work, I'll stop doing it. My wife was like, why are you wasting your time with that Cloudbuster? I said, I just want to see if it works. I have the pipe and I have stuff. I'll see if it works. And then it worked. And now she's like, Michael, we need rain. Okay. So she's a true believer now, but at first she was highly skeptical. But if you see something work, you repeat a scientific or some kind of experiment, you repeat it and you get the same results or similar results. You got to eventually think, well, there's something to this.
Yeah.
This is the beautiful tradition of experimentation, and it has a place. It's had a place throughout all of history, but it's been taken over by the scientists that have only they can do it. But the true experimentation was done locally by the Faradays and the Teslas, and that's the future. And I mean in this gargantuan, colossal behemoth that we're living in, the science and capitalism and all this, there were people that thought differently. And I don't know that you can ever fight this except to vote with your feet and walk back to the local level in your own experience and your own local community and begin to reinvent this stuff on your own.
Right.
Wow. No,
that's what Elliot was saying. You mentioned medical nemesis earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I have my students in one of my courses read the original article, Medical Nemesis, which was published in the British Medical Journal, written by a guy who was not a scientist or a physician. And when he died, they republished it. And they had an entire issue devoted to him. I asked the students, why do you think the British Medical Journal would publish an article by a guy who's not a scientist, not a physician, and it's highly critical of the professionalization of medicine and science? And they think about it. And then I asked the second part of the question, do you think we'd be published today?
Or like
they all say
about,
absolutely not.
Absolutely
not.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
What Ken's saying, and that's what Illich was saying through his whole career about in every domain he was criticizing that, whether it's in education and medicine in the church, that the professional managerial class has kind of been the death of innovation.
More priestly than the priesthood.
The most important contributor, I believe, in a pluralistic society is the conscientious objector. Okay, and you can't underestimate their role, and of course we don't have that function in our monolithic culture anymore. But I will say, and not to lionize BMJ, the British Medical Journal, as it's now called, but they do have that moderate function, that conscientious objector status. And I was very pleased. If you look at what happened during the pandemic, and I don't want to go into it now, but it was all orchestrated, okay?
Oh, sure.
None of this had to happen. And there was fraud and deceit at all levels from the very beginning. And by the way, my brother and I, we have recently published a paper. We went through and did an analysis of 108 countries, and we looked at social containment measures, mortality rates, from COVID vaccination rates, blah 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 blah. We had like maybe 20 different parameters, and the bottom line is there wasn't a single outcome. There was no outcome based on the social containment measures. There was no outcome on the vaccines. And in fact, countries that had higher per capita income and higher vaccination rates had slightly higher mortality rates. So this was a production put on by the medical industrial complex. And to their credit, they haven't gone that far in the process, but they were the first to start publishing critical editorials on the handling of the pandemic. And in November of 21, they published that really powerful and important whistleblower piece. The person that had been helping conduct research inside of Pfizer, and who was fired because she kept on complaining about fudging of data and stuff. And she took all the all these documents and turned it over to the public. And so, BMJ does this kind of stuff, and they've had that history, and you have to applaud them for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do.
Good. So it's probably a good place for us to wrap it up. I know you have other things to do.
We'll have to invite you on again, Ken, because in addition to your intelligence, your insights, you've got the right spirit.
Oh, thank you very much.
The right
Yeah, I like
quintessence.
this conscientious. Yeah.
All right.
Well, it was my honor. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for thanks, Ken, and thanks for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see everybody next week.